In the census of 1880, the settlement at the far western tip of Texas, 600 miles from San Antonio, closer to the capitals of 4 other states and Mexico than to its own in Austin, recorded a population of 736. It had no railroad, no paved road, no building taller than 2 stories. The nearest American city of any consequence was a punishing overland journey in every direction. It sat in the Chihuahuan Desert at the foot of the Franklin Mountains, in a landscape so barren that the Spanish soldiers who first crossed it in the 16th century nearly died of thirst before they reached the river. 50 years later, this same patch of sand and rock had concrete skyscrapers, a 25-foot Tiffany stained glass dome suspended over a hotel lobby, a 2,000-seat movie palace with a $60,000 Wurlitzer organ, and the world's largest custom smelter, processing $22 million worth of metal in a single year. The city had crossed 100,000 people. And it had done the entire thing, the whole arc from nothing to metropolis, in the span of a single long lifetime. This is the story of El Paso, and the first thing to understand is why anyone was there at all. The Franklin Mountains run roughly north to south through what is now the city, the southernmost tip of the Rocky Mountain chain in the United States. They rise over 7,000 feet at their peak, 3 miles wide and 23 miles long, a wall of rock in the desert. But at their southern end, the mountains break apart. A gap opens, a natural corridor between the ranges, and through it the Rio Grande flows south and east. The Spanish called it El Paso del Norte, the Pass of the North. For centuries, it was the only practical route connecting the interior of Mexico with the territory that would become the American Southwest. Everything and everyone moving between those 2 worlds had to come through the pass. The Spaniards came through. The Pueblo refugees came through after the Great Revolt of 1680. The U.S. Army came through after the Mexican-American War. The Butterfield Overland Mail came through, carrying letters between St. Louis and San Francisco. The geography was a bottleneck, and bottlenecks, it turns out, are where cities get built. But for most of those centuries, nobody built much. The settlements clustered on the south bank of the Rio Grande, the Mexican side, where irrigation from the river supported vineyards that produced wine said to rival the best in New Spain. On the north bank, the side that would become Texas, there was almost nothing. Apache raids made it too dangerous to farm. The river itself was the closest thing to a moat. As late as 1858, the north side was a scatter of adobe shacks around a place called variously Ponce's Rancho, Franklin, and Smithsville, a few hundred people at most, with streets that were, in the words of one surveyor, neither parallel nor at right angles. That surveyor was a 24-year-old Indiana farm boy named Anson Mills. He had flunked out of West Point, deficient in mathematics, the Academy noted, and was too embarrassed to go home. He rode the Butterfield stage to the far end of Texas, arriving on May 8, 1858, and looked down from a bluff at the Rio Grande winding through the pass. He later wrote that it was the most pleasant sight he had ever seen. Whether that says more about the landscape or about the journey that preceded it is an open question. Mills got himself appointed district surveyor and was hired by a group of land speculators to impose some order on the settlement. On February 28, 1859, he submitted a street map. He drew a grid. He named the streets. And he called the place El Paso. The name stuck. So did the grid. Walk through downtown El Paso today, and you are walking on Anson Mills's lines, drawn in 1859 by a man who couldn't pass math at West Point. Mills built the Overland Building, which for 30 years was the largest structure in town. He fought in the Civil War on the Union side, spent decades in the Army, and eventually came back to build a hotel on the corner overlooking the plaza he'd surveyed. That hotel, the Grand Central, opened in 1885, and the El Paso Times described it as the acme of luxury and comfort. It burned down in 1892. Mills would rebuild on the same spot decades later in a material that would not burn, but that comes later. For now, El Paso in 1880 was still a place where the most important thing that had ever happened was the arrival of the mail coach. The population was 736. 4 manufacturing establishments employed a total of 423 workers. The town had a claim to being at the crossroads of an entire continent, and almost nothing to show for it. Then the railroad came. On May 19, 1881, the Southern Pacific steamed across the Fort Bliss parade grounds and halted at the corner of Oregon and Mills, right in the middle of Anson Mills's grid. An El Paso author named Joseph Leach later wrote that everyone in town knew they were present at the end of one era and the beginning of another. The local historian C.L. Sonicson called it El Paso's finest hour. Within months, 4 more railroads arrived: the Santa Fe, the Texas and Pacific, the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio, and the Mexican Central. 5 railroad companies, all converging on a desert village of 700 people. Because this was the pass, the only pass, and every rail line connecting the Pacific coast to the Gulf had to come through it. The explosion was almost instantaneous. By June 1881, the population had doubled to 1,500. By 1890, it was 10,338. Bankers, merchants, cattlemen, miners, and gamblers flooded in. So did saloon keepers and the people the newspapers politely called undesirables. El Paso earned the nickname Six-Shooter Capital. At one point, sheriffs reportedly refused to take jobs in the city because they considered it too dangerous. Scores of saloons, dance halls, gambling houses, and brothels lined the main streets. The city fathers tolerated vice for a price, license fees essentially, and the town's reputation spread across the West. It was not yet the kind of place that attracted architects. What it attracted in 1881 was a pioneer industrialist from Kansas named Robert Safford Towne. Towne had toured the mines of the Mexican state of Chihuahua and understood something about the past that the railroad men also understood. Geography is destiny, and El Paso's geography sat at the seam between Mexican ore and American capital. In 1887, he secured backing from the Kansas City Consolidated Smelting and Refining Company and built a lead smelter on the banks of the Rio Grande. He bought 1,156 acres for the land. The price was $3,757, roughly $3 an acre. On that land, he would build the engine that drove El Paso's economy for the next century. The smelter started with 250 workers and a single 100-foot chimney. It processed lead and copper ore hauled by rail from the mines of northern Mexico and the American Southwest. Under Mexican President Porfirio Diaz, the company's railroad systems penetrated deep into Mexico, connecting dozens of mining operations to the El Paso plant. The economics were simple and enormous. Mexican ore, American processing, American profit. By 1899, the smelter had been absorbed into the newly formed American Smelting and Refining Company, ASARCO, and El Paso was its headquarters for the entire region. The scale grew relentlessly. By 1927, the El Paso Herald reported that the smelter employed 800 workers and commanded $1 million payroll. By 1929, the El Paso Evening Post described it as the largest and practically the only custom smelter of its type in the world. In an average year, the plant received more than 310,000 tons of copper, 30,000 tons of lead, 61,000 ounces of gold, and 5 million ounces of silver. The total value of metal processed in 1928 alone was estimated at $22 million. A community called Smelter Town grew up next to the plant, a city within a city, with its own hospital, its own rhythms, its own generations of families passing the work from father to son. The smelter's chimney rose above the desert like a signal fire. In time, it would rise much higher. Meanwhile, El Paso was learning how to be a city. The reform-minded citizens who had tolerated vice in the boom years began pushing back. In the 1890s, campaigns to curb the most visible forms of lawlessness gained traction. By 1905, the city enacted ordinances closing gambling houses and brothels. The frontier era was ending. Something more permanent was beginning to take its place. The man who gave that permanence a physical form arrived in 1903. His name was Henry Charles Trost, and he was 43 years old, born to German immigrants in Toledo, Ohio. His father had been a carpenter and grocer. Trost had trained as a draftsman, bounced through Denver, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, Fort Worth, Galveston, New Orleans, and Dodge City, and then spent 8 formative years in Chicago, the golden age of the Chicago School of Architecture, working in the orbit of Louis Sullivan, the father of the modern skyscraper. Trost absorbed Sullivan's principles, the strong vertical line, the organic ornament, the belief that a building should express its structure honestly. He may have worked in Sullivan's own firm, Adler and Sullivan, though the record is not entirely clear. What is clear is that when Trost left Chicago, he carried Sullivan's ideas with him into the desert. He arrived in El Paso because he saw what Anson Mills had seen 45 years earlier, a city at a crossroads, growing fast, with almost no real architecture. The population was approaching 40,000. Trost partnered with his brother Gustavus, formed the firm of Trost and Trost, and began designing buildings at a pace that is difficult to believe. He pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in the region, mixing local mica into the concrete so the walls shimmered faintly in the desert sun. He designed homes, churches, public buildings, schools, and commercial structures. He adapted the prairie school style to the rigors of the Southwest, wide overhanging eaves and balconies to shade the windows from the relentless sun, in a design philosophy he called Building for Arid America. By the time he died in 1933, his firm had designed roughly 650 buildings across El Paso, Albuquerque, Phoenix, San Angelo, and northern Mexico. No other architect has ever shaped a single American city so completely. His first masterwork in El Paso was the Mills Building, commissioned, in a satisfying loop of history, by the same Anson Mills who had platted the city's streets in 1859. Mills's Grand Central Hotel had burned in 1892, and for years the site on the corner overlooking San Jacinto Plaza sat empty. Mills hired Trost to design a replacement in a material that could not burn. Trost delivered a 12-story reinforced concrete tower, the second concrete frame skyscraper in the entire United States, and the tallest building in El Paso when it opened in 1911. He added mica to the concrete from local quarries. The facade curved gracefully around the street corner in a design that echoed Sullivan's work in Chicago. It was an audacious thing to build in a desert town that 30 years earlier had been an adobe village. 8 floors went up in 1911. 4 more were added in 1915. Trost moved his own offices into the building. It still stands. The following year, 1912, El Paso's ambitions reached even higher. A wealthy local businessman named Zach T. White had watched the Grand Central Hotel burn in 1892 and vowed to build something that could never be destroyed by fire. He partnered with a consortium of El Paso investors led by Felix Martinez, hired Trost, and together they traveled to San Francisco to study buildings that had survived the earthquake and fire of 1906. Trost drew the plans for a fireproof, earthquake-proof hotel, 10 stories of St. Louis buff brick and white terracotta over a skeleton of concrete and steel, with walls of salmon-colored scagliola made from gypsum quarried at White Sands, New Mexico. Italian artisans were brought to El Paso to create the ornate interiors. The crown of the building was a 25-foot stained glass dome built in 17 pieces in the style of Louis Comfort Tiffany, suspended over the main lobby like a jewel lowered into a setting. The hotel cost $1.5 million to build. The newspapers called it the $1 Million Hotel, underestimating slightly, and it opened on Thanksgiving Day, 1912. They named it the Hotel Paso del Norte. That dome, blue and amber glass, 25 feet across, flooding the lobby below with colored light, was the most improbable object in El Paso, and in a sense the most revealing. A Tiffany dome belongs in a Manhattan ballroom or a Newport mansion. It does not belong in a border hotel in the Chihuahuan desert 700 miles from the nearest major American city. But that was exactly the point. El Paso in 1912 was not building for what it was. It was building for what it intended to become. And then, almost immediately, history intervened, not from within the city, but from the country visible through the hotel's south-facing windows. On October 16, 1909, Presidents William Howard Taft and Porfirio Diaz had met in El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, the first meeting in history between a sitting U.S. president and a sitting Mexican president. The El Paso Herald called it the most eventful diplomatic event in the history of the two nations. The Juárez Customs House was decorated with 3 train car loads of flowers brought from Guadalajara. A gold and silver service that had belonged to the Emperor Maximilian, valued at $1 million, was laid on the table. There were toasts in 2 languages and gifts of gold goblets from the city of El Paso. 2 years later, the same spot was a battlefield. The Mexican Revolution broke out in 1910. Francisco Madero, leading the revolt against Diaz's 30-year dictatorship, established his revolutionary headquarters not in Mexico, but in El Paso, in offices 507 and 508 of the Caples Building, a Trost-designed structure downtown. His military commanders, Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco, gathered forces in the desert outside the city. Journalists from across the nation converged on the Sheldon Hotel, El Paso's most elegant lodging, where correspondents and Secret Service agents gathered alongside revolutionaries and government spies. The city had become, in effect, the backstage of a revolution, the place where the war was planned, financed, and provisioned, while the fighting happened across the river. On May 8, 1911, that distance collapsed. Against Madero's explicit orders, he feared stray bullets would hit El Pasoans and provoke the United States. Villa and Orozco attacked Ciudad Juárez. In a brilliant tactical move, Orozco ordered his troops to fight with their backs to El Paso, forcing the federal troops to aim south to avoid firing into the United States. The battle raged for 3 days, and El Pasoans watched. They climbed onto rooftops, scrambled up hillsides, perched on top of train cars, and lined the banks of the Rio Grande. The newspapers described a carnival atmosphere. Thousands of Americans watched a foreign revolution unfold in real time, close enough to hear the rifle fire, close enough for stray bullets to cross the border, as they did, striking buildings and killing several bystanders in subsequent battles. It was the most extraordinary spectacle in the city's history. A war as live entertainment, separated from the audience by nothing but a shallow river. The Sheldon Hotel's upper floors offered a particularly fine view. On the new Hotel Paso del Norte's 10th floor rooftop, guests sipped drinks and watched the smoke rise over Juárez. General Juan Navarro's federal troops surrendered on May 10th. Within weeks, Porfirio Diaz, the same man who had dined on Maximilian's gold service in Juárez just 2 years earlier, resigned and fled to Paris. The revolution sent waves of refugees north across the river, swelling El Paso's population. The city grew from 39,279 in 1910 to nearly 78,000 by 1925. Fort Bliss, the old frontier military post established in 1849, expanded enormously during the border tensions and World War I, pumping federal dollars and soldiers into the local economy. But the truly strange chapter of El Paso's prosperity was about to begin, triggered not by a war, but by a constitutional amendment. On January 17, 1920, Prohibition took effect across the United States. For most American cities, this was a nuisance or a catastrophe. For El Paso, it was an economic miracle. Juárez was wet, and Juárez was a 5-minute walk from downtown El Paso. The numbers tell the story more efficiently than any description. In the year before Prohibition, from July 1918 to July 1919, Border Immigration Supervisor Frank W. Berkshire recorded 14,130 tourists crossing the border into Mexico at El Paso. Within 1 year of the alcohol ban, that number rose to 418,735. The increase was nearly 30-fold. The El Paso Brewing Association didn't shut down. It simply packed up its equipment, moved across the river, and on opening day gave away free beer to 5,000 people. American tavern keepers, distillers, brewmasters, and nightclub operators followed, opening saloons, casinos, cabarets, and entertainment halls throughout Juárez. The Central Cafe, the Crystal Palace, Harry Mitchell's Mint Bar, the Juárez Racetrack, and the cockfighting rings. All of it fed by a river of American money flowing south for a drink and flowing back north for a hotel room. El Paso became the funnel. Thirsty Americans from across the Midwest, South, and Southwest arrived by train, checked into one of the city's growing roster of hotels, spent a few nights crossing the bridge for tequila and dancing, and went home. City promoters launched a publicity campaign in 1923 that ran in major magazines, reaching an estimated 50 million Americans. 12,000 inquiries a year poured in from 1924 to 1930, from tourists and prospective residents alike. 2 new international bridges were built to handle the traffic. The hotels boomed. The restaurants boomed. The retail shops along the downtown streets filled with customers. El Paso was getting rich, and the engine was not industry or agriculture, it was geography. Once again, the pass was the point. The border was the business. The peak arrived in 1930, and it arrived all at once, as if the city had been saving its energy for a single spectacular year. In a 12-month span, 3 landmarks opened that would define El Paso's skyline and self-image for generations. The first was the O.T. Bassett Tower, a 15-story Art Deco skyscraper at 303 Texas Avenue, designed by Trost and Trost. With its stepped setbacks, Gothic detailing, and a carved lintel that included a small sculpture of Trost's own face, it was the firm's most overtly modern creation, a declaration that El Paso belonged in the architectural conversation of the 20th century. It was briefly the tallest building in the city. Briefly because the second landmark surpassed it almost immediately. On April 9, 1929, the Sheldon Hotel, the elegant building that had served as the unofficial headquarters of the Mexican Revolution, the place where Taft had stayed during his meeting with Diaz, burned to the ground. Within months, a New Mexico-born hotel magnate named Conrad Hilton announced plans to build on the site. Construction began in the fall of 1929. 19 days later, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Hilton pressed on. He hired Trost and Trost to design a 19-story Art Deco tower at 106 Mills Avenue, named, of course, for Anson Mills's street on Anson Mills's grid. The El Paso Hilton opened on November 30th, 1930. At 239 feet, it was the tallest building in the city. It was Hilton's 8th hotel and his first high-rise, the building where a regional Texas hotel operator began to imagine himself as a global brand. Conrad Hilton himself lived in the building for years. His mother resided there until 1947. Elizabeth Taylor, married to Hilton's son Nicky, would later live in the penthouse. The lobby, with its exotic Spanish decorations, was described in the El Paso Herald as a fairyland. The building still stands, crowned by a Ludovici clay tile pyramidal roof visible for miles across the desert. The third landmark was the most spectacular of all, and the most defiant. On September 12, 1930, the Plaza Theatre opened at 125 Pioneer Plaza with a screening of the romantic musical comedy Follow Through. It had been built for more than $1 million. In the first year of the Great Depression, by a Dallas-based theater chain owner named Louis L. Dent, who had told the El Paso Times, "El Paso has been good to me, and I'm going to put something everybody will be proud of." The architect, W. Scott Dunn of Dallas, designed it in the Spanish colonial revival style. The capacity was 2,410. The interior was a fantasy. Hand-painted ceilings designed to look like the open night sky, mosaic-tiled floors, wrought-iron banisters, oil paintings and antiques in the lobbies and stairways. A domed tower rose in 3 tiers where the entrance met the auditorium. A $60,000 Wurlitzer organ, one of only 6 in the world, played before and after every screening, producing sounds of birdsong, ocean waves, and the clicking of horse hooves. The Brenograph projection machine could throw over 1,000 color effects onto the black and white films. An $850 marble and brass telecheck system alerted ushers when a seat became vacant. There was a nursery. There were electrically cooled drinking fountains. And outside, the largest theater between Dallas and Los Angeles rose from a city that, less than 50 years earlier, had been a scatter of adobe huts at a dusty river crossing. That year, 1930, the census counted 102,421 people in El Paso. The city that had started the century with fewer than 16,000 residents had more than sextupled in 30 years. It had the architecture, the hotels, the cultural institutions, the industrial base, and the population of a real American city. Henry Trost had designed its skyline. ASARCO powered its economy. The border fueled its tourism. Fort Bliss anchored its federal payroll. And at the center of it all, the Tiffany dome still hung over the lobby of the Hotel Paso del Norte, casting colored light onto the marble floors, less than a mile from Mexico. The 1930 census would turn out to be a high water mark, not for the city's population, which would continue to grow, but for the particular kind of city El Paso had been. The Depression hit hard. Cotton production in the county dropped more than 30%. The 1940 census showed a population of 96,810, a decline for the first time in the city's modern history. Prohibition ended in 1933, and with it the flood of thirsty tourists. The economic engine that had powered the 1920s boom simply switched off. The Juárez nightclubs didn't disappear, but they were no longer America's nearest wet bar. They became something else, a pleasure district that endured for decades on its own momentum, a place El Pasoans and soldiers from Fort Bliss would cross the bridge to visit on a Saturday night, but not the national destination it had briefly been. Henry Trost died on September 19, 1933. His brothers continued the firm into the early 1950s, but few buildings of significance were designed after his death. The era of the architect as city builder was over. What remained was his skyline. Dozens of buildings across downtown, each one a conversation between Chicago sophistication and desert necessity. Many of those buildings are still standing. Some have been beautifully restored. Others sit vacant and overlooked. The Abdu Building, the State National Bank Building, the Singer Sewing Company Building, the Roberts Banner Building, carrying the distinct mark of Trost, yet forgotten by the city he shaped. ASARCO, meanwhile, kept growing. The smelter added a zinc facility in 1948. A 612-foot smokestack went up in 1951 as demands increased for pollution control. And in 1967, the company built a second chimney, 828 feet tall. At the time of its completion, it was the tallest smokestack in the world. It stood higher than the Washington Monument, higher than the St. Louis Arch. For decades, if you looked west from anywhere in El Paso, the stack dominated the skyline. It was the city's most visible landmark, more prominent than any Trost building, more visible than the Franklin Mountains ridgeline. Employment at the plant peaked in the late 1960s and early 1970s at around 1,500 workers. By the mid-1970s, ASARCO was pumping $15 million a year into local salaries and paying $13.2 million to local companies for supplies and services. It was the largest industrial employer in the city. It was also poisoning the city. Sulfur dioxide emissions and suspended particulate matter contaminated the air. A hill near the university campus gradually turned black from the heavy emissions. In 1970, the city of El Paso filed a $1 million lawsuit against ASARCO, charging violations of the Texas Clean Air Act. The state joined the suit. Studies found elevated lead levels in the blood of children living near the smelter. When lead poisoning was suspected in the children of Smelter Town, the company bought the land and removed the residents. The community where generations of families had lived and worked, the city within a city, was erased. Today, nothing remains of Smelter Town but its graveyard. A 1975 injunction required ASARCO to spend $120 million on modernization and environmental improvements. Emissions of sulfur dioxide fell by nearly 2/3. But the economics of copper smelting were shifting. In 1999, a collapse in global copper prices forced the company to lay off 370 workers and shutter operations. 50 employees were kept on to maintain the plant. Company officials pledged to restart when conditions improved. They never did. Environmental liabilities from operations across the country drove ASARCO into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In 2009, the company announced the El Paso smelter would close for good. The stacks remained standing for 4 more years, twin pillars of concrete visible from both sides of the border. Monuments to something the city could neither fully celebrate nor fully condemn. There was a campaign to save them, an unlikely coalition of former workers, preservationists, and people who simply couldn't imagine El Paso's skyline without them. It failed. On the morning of April 13, 2013, hundreds of El Pasoans rose before dawn. They gathered on hillsides, in business parking lots, on the rocky ridges near the university campus, and on the rooftops of West El Paso homes. 3 paragliders hovered over Juárez to get a bird's-eye view. At 6:55 a.m., roughly 300 pounds of dynamite detonated inside the bases of the 2 chimneys. 2 cannon-like booms echoed across the valley. The stacks fell slowly, like enormous trees, onto cushioned beds of dirt lined with water cannons to suppress the dust. It took about 35 seconds. Huge gray clouds of concrete dust erupted and spread across the river into Juárez, where residents coughed and covered their faces. A century earlier, El Pasoans had stood on rooftops and watched a revolution begin across the river. Now they stood on rooftops and watched something end on their own side. The reactions were mixed. Some cheered, some stood in silence. A local doctor noticed that a lot of people weren't clapping. Ted Houghton, an El Paso businessman, watched from a special viewing area near Interstate 10. "It's the end of an era," he said. "It's changed the skyline." A former worker named Raimundo Rios was simply sad. Behind them, the 450 acres of contaminated soil that remained would take years to remediate. The smelter that had driven El Paso's industrial economy for 112 years left behind its own kind of monument. Invisible, toxic, and unfinished. El Paso today is a city of nearly 680,000 people. It is one of the safest large cities in America, a fact that surprises people who associate the border with danger. Fort Bliss remains the largest employer. The university that began in 1914 as the Texas State School of Mines and Metallurgy, housed in buildings Trost designed in a Bhutanese motif to match the mountain terrain, is now the University of Texas at El Paso, with nearly 25,000 students. The Sun Bowl, held since 1936, is the second oldest college football bowl game in the nation, after the Rose Bowl. Varney Speed Lines, a passenger airline that started in El Paso in 1934, became Continental Airlines. Sandra Day O'Connor, who grew up nearby, became the first woman on the Supreme Court. But the particular El Paso that rose between 1881 and 1930, the city of grand hotels and vaudeville theaters and reinforced concrete skyscrapers in the desert. The city where a West Point dropout's street grid became the foundation for an architect's skyline. That city exists now mostly in its buildings, the ones that survived. The Mills Building was restored for its 100th birthday in 2011, funded by local businessman Paul Foster, and reopened as an office and retail space. The Bassett Tower became an aloft hotel. The Hotel Paso del Norte, after decades of renovations and name changes, reopened in 2020 as part of Marriott's autograph collection. The Hilton, sold in 1963 and rechristened the Plaza Hotel, closed in 1991, sat empty for years and was purchased by Paul Foster, who restored it and reopened it in 2020 as the Plaza Hotel Pioneer Park. Elizabeth Taylor's penthouse is now a rooftop bar. The Plaza Theatre nearly didn't make it. By the 1970s, patronage had collapsed. The theater was sold. The Wurlitzer organ was sold separately to a collector in Dallas. But a local businessman named Carl O. Weiler bought it back and returned it to the building. In the 1980s, the El Paso Community Foundation stepped in and spent years raising money to save the theater from demolition. Rita Moreno appeared the day before the fundraising deadline. The community ultimately raised $9 million. The city took ownership. A $24 million restoration returned the theater to its 1930 splendor, and it reopened in 2006 as a performing arts center. The night sky still glows on the painted ceiling. The Wurlitzer still plays. These survivals are not inevitable. They are the result of specific people making specific decisions, often at the last possible moment. Trost's buildings were not designed to be historical relics. They were designed to be used. That many of them are still standing, still in use, still structurally sound, is a testament to the quality of their engineering and to the stubbornness of a city that, against all geographical logic, keeps insisting on its own existence. Walk through downtown El Paso on a late afternoon when the sun drops low enough to light the Franklin Mountains in that particular desert gold, and you can see the bones of what was built here. The curved facade of the Mills Building catching the light, the stepped profile of the Bassett Tower against the sky, the clay tile crown of the old Hilton, the mission-style parapet of the Plaza Theatre, the 10-story block of the Hotel Paso del Norte. They are all within walking distance of one another, all within walking distance of the border, all sitting on the grid that Anson Mills drew in 1859 when there was nothing here but a ranch and a river and the most important gap in 1,000 miles of mountains. Inside the Hotel Paso del Norte, the Tiffany dome still hangs over the lobby. It has hung there since Thanksgiving Day, 1912. Italian artisans built it in 17 pieces. It weighs, the record does not say exactly how much. It has survived 2 world wars, a revolution watched from the roof above it, a depression, a pollution crisis, several ownership changes, and 113 years of desert sun and border weather. The glass is blue and amber and gold. The light it casts on the floor shifts with the time of day. At noon it is one thing. At 5 o'clock it is another. It does not belong there. It never did. It belongs in some grand room, in some established city, on some coast, in a place where fine glass domes are expected and unremarkable. Instead, it hangs in a hotel lobby in the Chihuahuan Desert, at the foot of the Franklin Mountains, at the pass between 2 countries, in a city that a flunked-out cadet named, an Ohio architect built, and a Kansas industrialist fueled with Mexican ore. A city that was, in 1880, 736 people in a desert. The dome does not explain how that happened, but it proves that it did.